16th, 1989. That's about 3 decades ago. Our government invited Boris Yeltsin, #2 from the Communist Party of the USSR, to come in and visit Johnson Space Center in Houston. It's NASA. The goal was to impress him, to show off our military and our space capabilities. We knew the Soviet Union was weakened. President Reagan had a master plan to win the Cold War. And yet, Yeltsin was unimpressed. Our military might alone wasn't sufficient. In fact, Yeltsin shared that their missile technology was very advanced also. His presence in Houston, though, it really epitomized a clash, a debate between two systems. One system was based on economic liberty, and the other system was based on the collective, socialism, communism. In part 1, we talked about the 7 deadly sins of socialism, and we covered sins number 1 through 3. We said the essence of socialism is control. Socialism is not about fairness, and socialism is inherently theft. And we wrapped up with the reality that incentives work. The greatest economic benefits in history have happened after the establishment of private property rights and individual liberty. The greater the liberty, the greater the prosperity. Somehow, though, socialists believe that you can maximize production even without individual incentives. They think people will work harder for the greater good. This doesn't even work in theory, let alone in practice. So sin number 4, socialism is based on a faulty premise. Now consider this quote from Abraham Lincoln. "Free labor has the inspiration of hope. Pure slavery has no hope. The power of hope upon human exertion and happiness is wonderful. The slave master himself has a conception of it, and hence the system of tasks among slaves. The slave whom you cannot drive with a lash to break 75 pounds of hemp in a day, if you will task him to break 100 and promise to pay him for all that he does over, he will break you 150. You have substituted hope for the rod." Doesn't the same truth apply to socialism? If we give people hope and the opportunity to earn more, they earn more. That's capitalism, liberty, freedom. In socialism, it's slavery. If you get no more reward for working harder, why would you work harder? The idea is that you lose the incentive to produce, but you increase the desire to take. That's socialism. People support socialism today because they want free stuff. Democratic socialism is essentially the idea that you can vote yourself benefits from the people's treasury. Well, Prime Minister Thatcher summed it up. She said the problem with socialism is that you eventually run out of other people's money. Sin number 5, socialism is based on bad economics. We talk about democratic socialism, so they did a study. And here at the study, they said the total cost of single-payer health care, a jobs guarantee, and free college would require massive tax hikes. There's no way around it. The total cost is $42.5 trillion in new proposals over the next decade, and that's on top of the $12.4 trillion we expect to already have in deficit. And that really assumes that you can drive healthcare costs down, that healthcare suppliers will take 40% of what they're getting now. There's just huge economic problems. It's bad economics. They said a 30-year projected cost for these programs that Democratic Socialists are proposing is $218 trillion. Our whole economy is about $21 trillion. So this is 10 years of output, the entire economic output, to pay for what they want to spend of your money. Now, socialism is bad economics, not just on how you collect money, and it is bad there, but also how money is spent. Bob McEwen, great friend, did a PragerU where he explained why government is so terrible at healthcare.
Why is the government so bad at healthcare? They've been at it for 75 years and still can't get it right. It's expensive, access is spotty, it's mired in bureaucracy, and it's fraught with waste. Obamacare was supposed to fix all this, but instead, like every other government healthcare program before it, it just made things worse. Why? Because the government is a third-party payer. Let me explain. Suppose you're going to buy something for yourself. You have 2 priorities, price and quality. You want the highest quality for the lowest possible price. Say you're buying a television. You have many options: the size of the screen, the quality of the image, the price. Only you know which one best suits your needs and your budget. And a lot of companies are competing for your business. You do your research, you make your choice. This is called a first-party purchase. The person paying is the person using. Now let us suppose that either the price or the quality is not controlled by you. In this case, you're buying something for someone else. You care about the price because you're paying for it, but you're a little more flexible on the quality. A good example would be a wedding gift, say a coffee maker. You might think, by the time it breaks, they'll forget who gave it to them anyway. The cheaper one will be fine. All of us have bought things for others we never would have bought for ourselves. We care about the price because we're paying for it, but not so much about the quality because we're not going to use it. Or suppose we're going to use something, but we're not going to pay for it. Then we're concerned about the quality because we're consuming it. But the cost is not as important because we're not paying for it. Any father who ever got roped into paying for an open bar at a wedding understands this program. Nobody ever orders the cheap stuff when it's free. These are called second-party purchases. The person paying is not the person using. And now for the coup de grace. When it's not your money paying for something and you don't use it, then you're not concerned about either the price or the quality. Suppose the boss gives you $150 to buy a door prize for the office party. In a store window, you see a 6-foot-tall stuffed frog marked $149. You think, oh, that's perfect. Let's buy it. The raffle winner is awarded the 6-foot frog. Everyone laughs at the gag. Now, this is called a third-party purchase. A purchase that is made with money that's not yours. Therefore, you don't care about the cost. To buy something you're not going to consume. Therefore, you don't care about the quality. Here's the point. By definition, all government purchases are third-party purchases. The government spends other people's money on things it won't consume. It doesn't care about the price or the quality. Thus, there will always be waste in government spending. That's why, to paraphrase Abraham Lincoln, government should do only those things that a man cannot do better for himself. If 300 million Americans were free to buy health insurance for themselves, just as they buy their own life and home and car insurance, then that little gecko on television would offer us health insurance with a little more coverage for a little less cost. And he wouldn't be the only one. Insurance companies and hospitals would be working night and day to get our business. Quality would go up, prices would go down. It's already happened with laser eye surgery. It used to cost $2,200 per eye. Now it can cost as low as $500 per eye. That's the way free enterprise competition works every time. But when the government gets involved, costs go up, waste and fraud go up, essential medical services are denied or unavailable. These are the hallmarks of government healthcare bureaucracies around the globe. The sooner we make health insurance a first-party purchase again, the sooner Americans will get the healthcare they want. Finally. I'm Bob McEwen for Prager University.
Sin number 6. Socialism fails every time. Where has socialism failed? Well, believe it or not, it failed in America. We were one of the first socialist countries. It was before the United States was formed, but it was the Pilgrims in Plymouth Colony. It's failed in the USSR, it's failed in Zimbabwe, it's failed in Cuba, it's failed in Greece, it's failed in Iran, and it's failing right now in Venezuela before our very eyes. Now, where has it succeeded? Well, some might claim it's succeeding in China, or Scandinavia, or Boston. But the truth is, socialism fails every time. Every time it's discussed, someone brings up the story of the early Christian church. It's recorded in the book of Acts chapter 4, and they say, hey, but doesn't the New Testament teach socialism? Well, it's true. In Acts chapter 4, verses 32 through 35, it does describe a socialist type of society. But remember, it didn't last very long. But for a time, people in the early church did sell what they had, and they shared with others. Of course, it was all voluntary by a small group of people who were committed to one another, and it only lasted a little while. Those are the 4 conditions for success in socialism. In fact, the New Testament after that was quite clear that you can't take from people with force. Giving must be voluntary. It should not be under compulsion, according to 2 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 7. even though we know it's a failure, the Pilgrims tried it, and they were very sincere in trying it. So, Governor William Bradford, from his diary, let me read this to you. The failure of that experiment of communal service, which was tried for several years and by good and honest men, proves the emptiness of the theory of Plato and other ancients, applauded by some of later times. They said, by taking private property and the possession of it in community by a commonwealth would make a state happy and flourishing, as if they were wiser than God. Community of property was found to breed much confusion and discontent and retard much employment, which would have been to the general benefit. For the young men who were most able and fit for service objected to being forced to spend their time and strength in working for other men's wives and children without any recompense. The strong men, or the resourceful man, had no more share of food or clothes than the weak, who was only able to do a quarter of the labor of the other. This was thought injustice. The aged and graver men, who were ranked and equalized in labor, food, clothes, etc., with the humbler and younger ones, thought it indignity and disrespect to them. And men's wives, who were obliged to do service for other men, such as cooking, washing clothes, etc., they considered it a kind of slavery. And many husbands would not brook it. Let none argue that this is due to human failing. The failing is rather to the communistic plan of life itself. It was tried by good and able men, the men who helped found this country, the Pilgrims, when they first came here, and they proved out socialism fails every time. Now, some people will talk about Hugo Chavez and Venezuela, and a lot of celebrities used to celebrate that. In fact, Michael Moore wrote a tweet. Hugo Chavez declared that oil belonged to the people. He used the oil to eliminate 75% of extreme poverty, provide health care and education for all. Well, I got a question, the Dr. Phil question. How's that working out for you? We talked with Alan West in the Economic War Room. Here's what he had to say about socialism in Venezuela.
This is the interesting argument. Whenever you talk to them, well, they didn't understand pure socialism. Well, I mean, help me out here. You know, all of you guys were running down there to Venezuela, and you were, you know, slapping high fives with Hugo Chavez, talking about how great he is. Funny, you don't see him going down to Venezuela now, that they're eating out of garbage cans. And why Venezuela is so important to me, you know, there you got Caracas right there, beautiful city. Now, when I was a young lieutenant at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, my artillery tactics instructor when I was there was from Venezuela, Captain Gonzalez, and he showed us pictures of Venezuela. I mean, we were saying, why didn't the Army have a military base?
Beautiful.
Yeah, right here. I mean, one of the most prosperous, most beautiful, you know, countries in Latin America. And now look at what has happened in Venezuela because of socialism, because of Hugo Chavez, because of Nicolas Maduro.
And yet, when I was at the University of Tulsa, the son of the head of OPEC, the Venezuelan oil minister at the time, was getting a petroleum engineering degree. Venezuela has the largest reserves of petroleum, proven reserves, on the planet.
And what has happened? They nationalized that economic production, and look what has happened to that country. And also, they made all of these promises about how they were going to redistribute wealth from one group and give to another. You know, I live down in Plantation, Florida, down in South Florida, and just west of us is a city called Weston, Florida. And when you go to Weston, Florida, you see two flags. You see the American flag, you see the Venezuelan flag. Because all of the producers, all of the people that were working hard, they left. They had the means to do so. Now, the question is, as we hear these socialists in America talk, where do we go?
Yeah. If America's gone, where can we go?
And where does the rest of the world go?
So where has it worked? Name
not.
it, where? Okay, so what about what about Europe?
No, well, you know what? It's interesting that you're starting to see many of these countries in Europe moving away from it.
Socialism does fail every time. Now, of course, people are going to point. They're going to say Scandinavia is a socialist utopia. That's what Bernie Sanders basically made as his case when he ran for president. No, Bernie Sanders, Scandinavia is not a socialist utopia. And where do I get that? That's actually an article written in the Boston Globe in October of 2015. It says, liberals have a crush on Scandinavia. It's a country whose very name has become a synonym for a materialist paradise, observed Time magazine in a 1976 story. Sweden was a poor nation for most of the 19th century. But that began to change as they adopted capitalist principles around 1870, and they turned to free enterprise reforms. Robust capitalism eventually replaced the former agrarian system, and Sweden grew rich. Property rights, free markets, and the rule of law combined with large numbers of well-educated engineers and entrepreneurs. And according to Jeff Jacoby, Scandinavia's hard left turn didn't come until much later. It was in the 1960s and early 1970s, and taxes soared, welfare payments expanded, and entrepreneurship was discouraged. Sweden's world-beating growth dried up. In 1975, it had been the fourth wealthiest nation on earth, measured by GDP per capita. By 1993, it dropped to 14th. By then, the Swedes began to regard their experiment with socialism as, in a certain phrase, a colossal failure. Now, the Foundation for Economic Education looked at all of the European economies, and they compared them to the United States. And what they concluded is that most of Europe is a lot poorer than most of the United States. Living standards are markedly higher in the U.S., according to their article from April 2016. And in fact, they ranked all of the states on per capita income, starting with North Dakota with massive oil wealth, which had, in 2014, the highest per capita income, followed by Alaska and Wyoming and Connecticut and New York and Massachusetts and Delaware. You know, you have to go all the way down to number 38 before Germany would compare with an American state. So the best of Europe ranks about 38th compared to the 50 states in the United States. Sweden is tied approximately with $45,000 of per capita income in 2014, followed by Denmark. But it's roughly the same as New Mexico, Arizona, Kentucky, Florida, Montana. The best Europe has to offer is actually down on the rankings when compared to the U.S. states. I think that makes it pretty clear. The greater the liberty, the greater the prosperity. The greater the socialism, the greater the poverty. Okay, so it was tried in Boston, Massachusetts. It's still being tried there. I looked at the Boston Globe, and I found that there is a Dudley Doe, a fair wage pizza shop, and they decided that they're going to act as socialists, and they're going to make sure that everybody gets a fair wage. And guess what? It failed miserably, and they closed their doors. Same Boston Globe paper. Here's an article. It's not your imagination. It's getting more expensive to eat out. And I'll read the quote. It's the pricey salads in the downtown lunch places that get to Robert Hughes, a private banker. You get this pre-made salad. He calls it the Subway of salads. And you think, this is not a $12 salad. The weakness started in 2016 when labor costs started to rise, analyst Bonnie Riggs said. So they increased restaurant prices quarter after quarter to the point that consumers have said it's not a good value, it's cheaper to eat at home. That was a socialist experiment applied in Boston, Massachusetts, and guess what? Economic laws still apply. Socialism fails every time. Now, you might want to talk about China, and granted, China has gone from a very poor nation to the second largest economy on earth. And there's no doubt about that. It happens from the late 1990s to the present. Now, we'll talk about in the Economic War Room some of the reasons for this. Intellectual property theft. They've stolen a lot of our technology. They're hacking systems. They're doing unfair trade practices. All those things are true. But the reality is that some of China's prosperity has come because they've opened up and allowed limited private property rights. They've allowed people to be entrepreneurs. And so some to get into East Berlin and into communism, it was people desperately wanting to get out. Socialism fails every time. Sin number 7, and this is perhaps the worst, the culmination of all of the sins. Socialism leads to communism, and communism kills. Vladimir Lenin said the goal of socialism is communism. The only reason you adopt democratic socialism is to get to a communist. And that's what a Democrat socialist writer has recently said. In fact, Adam Shaw, August 2nd, 2018, as reported in Fox News, the rise of democratic socialism has been one of the key developments by the Democratic Party in recent years, first with the popularity of Bernie Sanders and more recently Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. One of the ways the movement is presented is the claim this is not your grandfather's socialism. It's not the socialism of the former Soviet Union or Venezuela or other failed states. It's more a Scandinavian healthcare system than overthrowing the bourgeois. But now a Democrat socialist writer is leveling with voters. He's telling them that actually, yes, they want to topple capitalism. He says, I'm a staff writer at the socialist magazine Jacobin and a member of the Democrat Socialists of America, and here's the truth. In the long run, Democrat socialists want to end capitalism. Here's what's scary about that. Socialism leads to communism, and communism kills. From the Wall Street Journal, November 2017, it was marking the 100 years since Lenin had the coup in Russia, and socialism was first tried on a grand scale. It says, in the 100 years since Lenin's coup, the ideology devoted to abolishing markets and private property has left a long, murderous trail of destruction. A century of communism power, 65 million dead. It's really bad. When you have Stalin as the head of the Soviet Union, who's actually inducing famines to wipe out certain parts of the population, when you have gulags and concentration camps, this is perhaps the deadliest plague on the world. Much worse even than Hitler's fascism. Communism kills. It's a terrible track record. And we know that if we adopt even democratic socialism, the goal is to lend itself to communism. Now I'll tell you, in Scandinavia, they have a form of democratic socialism. We even have some socialism here in the United States with our Medicare system and with Social Security and so forth. But it only works when it has competition. That's the ugly truth of socialism. Unless there's competition, socialism degenerates into control, and that control leads to mass murder too often. But in Sweden, they know people can get up and leave and go to another country, and so they have to be on their best behavior. They know they're going to get reelected. But if you elect democratic socialists and they take total control of a government, there's no competition. As soon as Nicolas Maduro in Venezuela could abolish the People's Congress, he did it. He took away the people's rights. They rigged the elections, and they took away your right to choose. Socialism leads to communism, and communism kills. So, we had Frank Gaffney in the war room out of D.C., and he told us a little bit about fighting communism.
It is heartbreaking to me that we are having this conversation, having had one of the great victories in the history of this country over the totalitarian and thoroughly hostile ideology of Soviet communism, only to find ourselves a generation or two later having young people, presidential candidates, as well as candidates for other offices, embracing what is the sort of stepchild of communism, democratic socialism, and seeking to induce lots of other Americans to think that it would just be terrific if we could bring that system here. And nothing could be further from the truth, of course. And my old boss, President Reagan, used to say, every generation faces an existential threat to freedom. The one we're confronting today is the combination of the offspring of the Soviet communist, Marxist, Leninist ideology, this socialism, democratic or otherwise, and the common cause that it is making with another form of totalitarianism, similar in many respects. I actually think of it as communism with a god. It's best described, as Andy McCarthy likes to say, as Sharia supremacism.
The bottom line is, socialism doesn't work, but incentives do work. The problem that we face in America is not from too much capitalism, but really it's rather from too much control. Mercatus Center did a study, and they said, we've enacted all these regulations, and during the Obama administration, regulations increased at the fastest rate they had in history. We were telling you, there were regulations at local levels telling you how much soda you can drink and how much a restaurant could sell. Now they're talking about banning straws and all these regulations. If we took our regulations back to the level of 1980, go back to 1980 and said, that's the level of regulation we're going to have. According to the Mercatus Center, their model predicted that our economy would be at least 25% larger. In other words, the growth of regulation since 1980 have cost the United States about $4 trillion in gross domestic product. That's about $13,000 per person in 2012 alone. Bring that up to 2018, and you adjust for the average household income. If we had 1980 level regulation today, the average family of four would be earning $130,000 or more per year. Wait a minute, didn't I tell you that that's the level that it takes to be in the top 10% of incomes? That's right. According to IRS data, the top 10% of American wage earners household at that household level bring in about $130,000 a year. What's the problem? What's kept us from all being at that average of the current top 10%? Excessive regulation. It's control. The greater the liberty, the greater the prosperity. One of the main reasons people turn against the notion of capitalism is that our excessive government has protected big business to the exclusion of true freedom, truly free markets. It's not freedom. It's a Marxist notion called state monopoly capitalism. We shouldn't confuse the free market with crony capitalism. I agree. This is where Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and I agree. Crony capitalism, it's not capitalism, and we got to get rid of it. We need as much freedom, individual liberty as possible. Today's political left wrongly blames market competition for the very problems caused by the want of market competition. The failures of state monopoly capitalism. Identifying this mistake 125 years ago, the labor advocate and free market libertarian William Bale remarked that where it is that there is competition is assailed today, a close analysis reveals not the evil effect of competition, but the need for greater liberty. And what I got to share, I've said it many times and I borrowed it from my friend Bob McEwen. Let's hear what he has to say.
Well, regulations are ways that bureaucrats, politicians, tell you what you should do, but they don't know what you're doing. And so they say that I think that every tractor should have a bumper on it so that no one can run under it and get hurt. But if you do that, then you can't produce corn. But they don't care about that because they have regulation without revenue. They have control, and the degree to which they do that is the degree to which they foul up the innate capacity of free people to find solutions. Let me just run through some quick stats. That 4% of the population of the world call themselves Americans. There are skyscrapers all over the world. Why? Because an American by the name of Elisha Otis invented the elevator. And where are they? In places that are 100, 120 degrees in the Middle East. Why? Because an American named Willis Carrier invented the air conditioner. And how did they get there? They flew airplanes that were invented by Americans. And they had light bulbs and telegraph and telephone. There's a little girl put a chip in her puppy dog in Poland. If she loses it, she can go on an iPad and through the internet use the global positioning system to find out where her puppy dog is. All of them conceived, invented, and maintained by Americans. Now, are Americans smarter than anybody else? Americans have been freer than anybody else. And when you have regulations that tell people that they cannot even invent or create or find solutions to things, they must do it the way that some unnamed bureaucrat with his taxation without revenue, this is a person that controls the individual spirit that made America the hope and blessing to the entire world.
True free markets only work by the golden rule. It's got to be a free and fair exchange. If I'm willing to give up some of my money, you've got to give me something that I value more for it. That's how a free market works. When you mandate that people buy certain things, like you have to buy health insurance or you have to buy this or that, you're actually taking away liberty. The golden rule functions much better. When we have a free and fair exchange, we have greater prosperity. I want you to understand that this really isn't about fairness or compassion. There's a study, Google did a study, and they found that the average annual contributions reported by conservatives were double those of liberals. There's another study that was reported in the New York Times, and the author of a book on donors to charity says, who really cares? According to his data, conservatives give at least 30% more to charity than households headed by liberals. So it's not about fairness or compassion. Conservatives are just as compassionate, if not more compassionate, according to Google and according to Arthur Brooks, than liberals. No, it's about who is mandating where the money is going and who's controlling it. So there's a meme. Can you imagine Jesus sitting on the Sermon on the Mount and he's speaking and he says, help your neighbor and take care of the poor. And someone in the crowd raises their hand and says, but Jesus, why can't we just give our money to the Romans and let them do it for us? I mean, that would be ludicrous. The point is this. You can be generous as a freedom-loving individualist. You can be as generous as you like. When the government collects the money, they tend to use it to enrich themselves and their cronies. Socialism results in less help for those who need it than true free markets. Then, socialism eventually runs out of other people's money. I said socialism fails every time. You should look at the grocery market shelves of Venezuela today. They're already shutting water off. This was one of the wealthiest nations on earth with the world's largest oil reserves. And here's a quote from AFP News. Several people were killed and more than a dozen injured in socialist Venezuela on Thursday after they tried to loot stores for food so they would not starve to death. How compassionate is that? Socialism fails every time. But freedom wins every time. Remember when I told you about Boris Yeltsin and how he was at NASA and he was kind of, not that impressed when he saw our military technology? He said, we can do that. We've got great scientists, great minds, great military in the Soviet Union. But on his way out of town, he said, anything you want to do? He said, you know what I'd really like to do? I'd like to stop and visit an American supermarket. I know you can put up great missiles, so can we. But if you could feed your people, that would be something special. So they brought out a map and they laid it in front of him and said, you pick which supermarket you want to visit. Because they knew that if they took him to a specific one, they'd think it was staged. So he said, I want to go to this. It was a Randall's in Houston. He walked in and he was shocked. He walked aisle after aisle and saw all of the fresh food, the produce. Then he saw all the packaged goods. And he said, this is amazing. Your shelves are all full. Here's a quote from his autobiography. He said, when I saw those shelves crammed with hundreds, thousands of cans, cartons, and goods of every possible sort, for the first time I felt quite frankly sick and despair for the Soviet people. That such a potentially super-rich country as ours had been brought to a state of poverty. It's terrible to think of it. That's when he realized socialism fails every time. And he saw what freedom could do. He went back to the Soviet Union, and he became the first president of the Free State of Russia. This is how the Cold War was won. A little old supermarket in Texas convinced the number 2 communist in the world that freedom wins. Okay, this is an economic war. It flat out is between liberty and control. I think we've demonstrated that the greater the liberty, the greater the prosperity. You want greater prosperity. This war is going to impact everything about you. It's going to impact your wealth, your livelihood. It's going to impact your way of life. That's why we created the Economic War Room. That's why we've invited you in to share these truths with you. So we need a battle plan. And here it is. 2 things. Number 1, I invite you to ask your advisor. If you've got money in the bank, if you've got stocks or bonds or real estate, you're a capitalist. You're an investor. You have an advisor most likely, and if you do, you need to ask him or her, am I invested in economic freedom? You want to put your money where the greatest economic freedom is taking place, where there's strong property rights. My old boss, John Templeton, he taught me to invest in those nations that were embracing freedom. So we've got a heat map. I want you to look at it. The heat map shows the development of economic freedom over time in the various nations around the world. You want to invest in those places that are embracing freedom. Now, we don't offer specific investment advice in the Economic War Room, so please consult with your personal advisor. But the second step of the battle plan to win this war, absolutely, we need your help. We created this Economic War Room for you and your economic warriors coming in. But we need help educating the next generation. I mean, we see that young people are embracing socialism and they don't even know what it is or how to pay for it, but they're blindly embracing it. We're going to have to get this word out. So here's what you can do. You can go to economicwarroom.com. You can sign up for a free trial if you're not already a subscriber. You can get all your friends to sign up for free trials, and you can show them these two parts on the 7 deadly sins of socialism. Education is one of the most important things we do in the War Room, and we need your help to get the word out. Now here's the takeaway. We know that President Reagan won the Cold War, but he warned us that we have to teach our children the benefits of freedom or we'll lose it. So listen to President Reagan talk about the next generation.
Our founding fathers here in this country brought about the only true revolution that has ever taken place in man's history. Every other revolution simply exchanged one set of rulers for another set of rulers. But only here did that little band of men so advanced beyond their time that the world has never seen their like since evolve the idea that you and I have within ourselves the God-given right and the ability to determine our own destiny. Freedom is never more than one generation away from extinction. We didn't pass it on to our children in the bloodstream. The only way they can inherit the freedom we have known is if we fight for it, protect it, defend it, and then hand it to them with the well-thought lessons of how they in their lifetime must do the same. If you and I don't do this, then you and I may well spend our sunset years telling our children and our children what it once was like in America when men were free.
Remember, what we see as a marketplace, our enemies view as a battle space. This is Kevin Freeman from the Economic War Room.